Hi guys. Okay, so this is the homework that I gave you. This is the homework that I gave you on Thursday to do. It was based on space travel. So I have it done in another part here, and I'll clip it in so that you have it. But I just want to kind of fly through the answers to make sure that there aren't any questions. So space exploration has enabled us to develop new technologies and learn more about our world and the space within it. And the space within which it exists. However, humans struggle when it comes to being in space. Our body is not designed to be in reduced gravity effect of space for long periods. Identify 3 effects in the human body from being in space. So the heart becomes weaker, bone density decreases, and increases in blood pressure. You could have muscle degradation there, sleep deprivation. There's a couple you could have put in there. I'm not sure if I changed this to 2 for you guys, so I meant 2. I'm sorry. Many space agencies are looking to develop spacecraft to allow humans to travel beyond our moon and further into space. However, many problems arise in terms of fuel consumption. Using your knowledge of renewable sources of energy, identify 2 sources of renewable energy that could possibly be used to allow deep space travel. So the 2 that I could come up with, I did a little bit of research on this to see if there was anything kind of cutting edge, but really the most cutting edge is the nuclear sources of energy. So using mainly fusion, to be honest, as a power source, and then the other one is solar, obviously. There have been many disasters in space exploration. From what you have learned, describe a space disaster that took place and identify the cause of it. So I suppose we did talk about a few space disasters. I went with this one because this was the one that was in the movie, Apollo 13. In 1970, the oxygen tank exploded, so the astronauts couldn't land on the moon, and then they went through a huge amount of struggles to actually make it back to Earth safe. Okay, so make sure that you have one space disaster. Speaking of, here's another one. The Challenger space shuttle exploded within 2 minutes of takeoff. Space travel and exploration has many challenges and can be very dangerous. The picture shows a disaster that took place in 2003 when the space shuttle was taking off. From your knowledge of space exploration, describe 4 areas that you think are hazards. Okay, so we this is crossover. There's space disasters, obviously, like the 2 that we just discussed. There's also going to be all the health risks that we discussed. Okay, so any of them. Osteoporosis is the loss of bone density in the human skeleton. Bone loss in space can occur after only 1 week. When astronauts float around in a spacecraft, they are not using their bones in the same way as they do on Earth. A 45-year-old astronaut completes a space mission to Mars. Complete the following questions in relation to the graph below. So, from the graph, identify the possible age at which the average adult may get osteoporosis. So here's osteoporosis, here's the line here. So here's your average adult, and it's at this point here, so approximately 60, where they could get osteoporosis. From the graph, identify the possible age that an average adult on the Mars mission may get it. So you can see that happens here. So 47-ish, 45 to 48 there. Identify the force that stimulates our body to produce and strengthen our bones. So it's the force of gravity, the gravitational force. The Earth and the Moon orbit around the Sun. At times during their orbit, they can get in the way of each other. When this happens, we call the event an eclipse. In the space provided, draw the position of the Sun, Earth, and Moon during a lunar eclipse. So in a lunar eclipse, it's an eclipse of the Moon. So the Earth goes in the middle, and the Sun shines a light, but the light can't pass through Earth, so you get a shadow on this side and the moon passes into the shadow. A solar eclipse, this is where the moon blocks some of the sun's light and you get a small shadow on the Earth's surface, which kind of moves around the Earth in what's called the line of totality. So this obviously we haven't done recently, so you might need to look back on some of these notes. On Earth, we experience a lunar eclipse more often than a solar eclipse, based on your knowledge of knowledge of the lunar phases and the positions of the moon. Explain the statement above. So I have lunar eclipses are more widely visible because the Earth casts a much larger shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse than the moon casts on the Earth during a solar eclipse. So the Earth is bigger than the moon, so the shadow that it casts completely eclipses the moon, especially if it passes right into the center of the shadow. Whereas when the moon blocks the sun's light, it's only ever blocking part of the light on a very small section of Earth, and so you just don't see them that often. Looking at the picture, explain why humans need to wear eye protection when viewing a solar eclipse, but do not need eye protection for a lunar eclipse. Looking at the moon at night is very safe, and looking at a solar eclipse is quite dangerous because you're looking directly at the sun. Match the statements to the correct word from the list. So the partial darkened shadow is called the penumbra. Area in complete darkness is totality. So that's what we were talking about, the line of totality. An area in a complete dark shadow is the umbra, the umbral shadow. The moon rotates around the Earth once every 27 days. Explain why we do not experience a lunar eclipse every month as a result. There's some really cool, if you actually put that question into Google, there's some good little animations. So the moon's rotation is kind of tilted. So if you imagine, it doesn't go around the equator of the Earth, it kind of tips. So it goes kind of high on the left and low on the right, and high on the left and low on the right. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't always line up exactly in between the Earth and the sun. It kind of depends on the Earth and the sun's rotations as well. Okay, so like I said, I'll put those answers into, I'll put them in here with chapter 42. So I'll kind of replace, I suppose, the exam questions with the answers to the exam questions. Okay, so for today, I want to continue on with our last chapter, which obviously we're going to be limited in because we can't actually do the habitat study. So I just want to kind of go through the some of the theory. Okay, so it's chapter 8 in your book. It's under biology. The junior cycle specification is that students should be able to conduct a habitat study, research and investigate the adaptation, competition and interdependence of organisms within specific habitats and communities. Okay, because we're back in biology here, there's a lot of stuff you just have to learn. Okay, what is an ecosystem? Sorry, now let me get my iPad. Connolly. Biology, chapter 8. Okay, so what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a study, ecology is the study of how plants and animals interact with each other and with their surroundings or their environment. And the living world is divided into ecosystems. So ecosystems are similar groups of plants, animals, and environments. So that's essentially what they are. They are similar groups of plants, animals, and environments. So some examples are deserts, tropical rainforests, grasslands, and seashores. So I suppose the type of animals and plants that live on a desert wouldn't survive in a grassland, for example, and vice versa. Plants and animals that are on the seashore, you wouldn't find them in the grassland. So you have, they are ecosystems, similar groups of plants, animals, environments. So our study will be a grassland study. We'll go into the park. Most students in Ireland either do a grassland or a seashore. So if your school happens to be close to the beach, you can do a seashore, but most people do grasslands. Okay, so that's the ecosystem we're going to be studying. Habitats. Ecosystems are large areas containing similar types of environments and living things. Normally, an ecosystem is too large to study. Instead, a small local part of the ecosystem called a habitat is what we study. Okay, so a habitat is a place where an organism live, and there's loads that you can do. So like I said, we're going to concentrate on the grassland, so we'll probably choose a part of the park, kind of between the school and actually getting into the park, where we have some of the kind of forested area, and we have trees that we can look in and different leaves coming off different trees. Um, you can go like with a hedgerow. I know in my school um, we had this massive hedge that kind of edged the whole school, but the back of it was onto like a river, so there was kind of interesting things to see there. So um yeah, you basically, the habitat is you choosing a portion of the ecosystem. Okay, so you just choose a section, and that's the section that you work in. So I put these in. These are the notes from basically sent out by the department. So I just put these in. Um, they have nice, concise descriptions. You don't need to take notes down twice. But a habitat is a place where an organism live. Woodland and grassland are examples of habitats. Organisms vary from one habitat to another because of different conditions, such as shade, soil, pH, temperature, and minerals in the soil. I mean, even if you took the park, like, you'd probably find slightly different things over near the trees and the grass than you would over near the water. Do you know what I mean? So even within one ecosystem, you have those different habitats, which would have different conditions. A community is all of the living things in a habitat. A typical Irish woodland community consists of oak trees, ash trees, nettles, bluebells, foxes, squirrels, rabbits, thrushes, snails, earthworms, beetles, and many other organisms, all interacting with each other. Okay, so that's just literally talking about the habitat that we're going to study. Like, I'm just looking at the habitats here. Like, we would definitely will look at like a section of grass, and we'll be able to see kind of, hopefully by the time we get back, there might be daisies growing or buttercups growing, and you might have some nettles or things like that. And we'll, like I said, take a portion of the kind of wooded area where we have trees. We'll get different leaves from that. Obviously, all of this is taking place in a local park. Um, so yeah, we should be able to get a good variety of different plants and animals from that study. Okay, so how to carry out a habitat study? When you carry out a study, and if you do Leaving Cert geography, and it's not in yet, but there will be. You do ecology in Leaving Cert, biology as well. You do in geography, it's called a field study. In biology, it's called field work. Same thing. If possible, the habitat should be visited during different seasons. We tend not to do that. We tend to try and go when you're going to get the most plentiful, results back, which is why I didn't want to go in December. As well as that, it's just not pleasant. It's much more pleasant to go out there when it's a bit warmer, and because you're going to be out there probably for 2-3 hours. Like, it's miserable if it's cold and wet. But the whole point would be from a scientific point of view that you can see, how does it change over the course of a year. There is a recognised countryside code. Like, I don't have it's in your book, but basically this is just, I suppose in certain parts of the country, if they wanted to visit a grassland, they might actually be visiting somebody's land, as in somebody owns the land, as opposed to us visiting a local park. So there's things like, don't leave the gate open because there might be animals that could escape, and obviously don't leave litter around, which would apply to us too. And be aware that we're going to be working in a local park and there are people there walking their dogs, bringing their young kids for walks. So all of this is actually a written down countryside code that you're supposed to protect the environment you're studying. Okay. The study of a habitat involves 5 steps. Okay. So we'll do this over the course of, like I said, 2 or 3 classes, 2 or 3 hours. The first one is to draw a map of the habitat. We'll definitely be able to photograph. We all have our iPads. So the idea would be that we go out, we photograph the couple of areas that we're going to study, and then we go back and we make a sketch. Okay, because we're going to add the things we find onto that sketch. So that would be the first thing we do. The second thing, measure and record the environment or the non-living features of the habitats. I'm going to talk about those today. It's just things like temperature, soil, pH, things like that. Now, we don't have like some of the really high-end equipment that you need to do some of those things, but we'll definitely be able to get a temperature. We'll be able to get a soil pH, and we'll be able to get a couple of the environmental features. Third is to identify and name all the organisms in the habitat. So I'll go on to that now in a second. Collect samples of the organisms in the habitat that cannot be identified. So the ones that you, like if you look and you see a daisy and you know that that's a daisy, then you identify it as a daisy. You found this many daisies in your habitat. If you find something and you don't know what it is, then you need to collect it so it's identified in the lab. And then we do like a frequency study. So it's okay, I found a daisy, but how many daisies did you find? I found a buttercup. How many buttercups? I found an earthworm. How many earthworms? So you do like a frequency study for it as well. And that's the only one. The frequency study is like, it's interesting if you do it at different times of the year, because you're going to have a massive difference in the amount of flowers that you'll see if you do this in April compared to doing it in December. So obviously it would be interesting from that point of view. Okay, so again, just a quick note from the junior cert notes. A habitat study can monitor the variety of life in an area and can detect changes caused by pollution over time. Again, that is a habitat, that is not our habitat study. You wouldn't be testing this, in first year and then testing it 10 years later and then testing it 15 years after that. That's not what we do. In a habitat study, the area is mapped. The non-living factors such as light intensity, temperature, and soil pH are recorded. Now, I don't know. It's actually interesting because you can get a lot of these things on like apps on your phone, which wouldn't have been able to do obviously up to a while ago. So I don't know if maybe there might be an app we can get for like light intensity. You can definitely measure the sound, and you can on your phone you can measure the sounds, how many decibels of sound are in the area. The temperature we'll obviously be able to do. Soil pH, I have a pH meter, so we should be able to do that. Animals can be collected and identified with a biological key and then released immediately back into the same area. So you can collect animals that you don't recognize into a jar, identify them using the identifiers, which we'll talk about, and you then have to release them back in the same area that you took them from. Again, this is going back to that countryside code. Okay, we don't disturb the ecosystem. The frequency of plants is recorded using a quadrat survey, which we'll talk about as well. Okay, so it then goes into these steps. So step 1 is map the habitat. Draw a simple map to show the main features of the habitat. So walls, fences, ponds, large trees, hedges or paths, and if possible photographs. So we'll probably do that the other way around. Given we have our iPads, we'll photograph it, we'll bring it back into the lab and we'll draw a map of the section of the park that we're going to use for our field study. Measure the environmental factors. So this is what I was saying, the non-living features. They're called abiotic features, and they have a couple of them here. So temperature, you need a thermometer. Light intensity, a light meter. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do that. Soil pH, that should be fine. Wind direction, should be able to do that. rainfall gauge, like we could do that. That's easy enough to do, like around the time. So if we remember kind of to, if we're going to do 3 days worth of study, that's like a week. So um, if we put a jar somewhere, you'd have to dig a little hole in the ground, buried in the ground, and let it rain, or like just leave the week go, and you could take the jar back in and measure the amount of rain that fell. So we could definitely do that. So we need to measure and record. I was saying perhaps a sound meter as well. Just because I suppose it's in the middle of Dublin, it's quite busy, and it would be interesting to see. I think that part of the park, to be fair, is quite quiet, but it would be interesting to see. Okay, so this is where I'm going to finish today. Identifying the organisms. If possible, organisms in the habitat should be named and listed on site. Plants and animals should be removed from the habitat only if they cannot be identified there and then. Organisms can be identified by comparing them to drawings or pictures in books, or by using a suitable key. Now, again, I would argue that we all have iPads. There's no reason to be taking animals, particularly animals, obviously, away from their habitat. So if you find an animal that you can't recognize, take a couple of really good zoomed in clear photos so you can see the amount of legs, whether they have legs or not, their colors, things like that. And you can identify them from the picture as opposed to taking them. Yeah? So an identification key, this is the type of stuff that you will have. So you look up like a plant identification key, and it's this type of thing. Okay, so if the leaves have parallel veins, or the veins are not parallel to the leaf. Okay, so this one here has parallel veins, so that means that's plantain. All the other three do not have parallel veins, so we go to question 2. The edges of the leaves are not jagged. So these leaves are not jagged there, those ones. They're just kind of scalloped. They're not jagged, like these are jagged. So that means B must be a daisy. The leaves have jagged edges, so these two have jagged edges. So we move to part 3. Long leaves growing from the base of the stem, so that's that one there, so we can identify that it's a dandelion. And leaves are more rounded and growing along the length of the stem, so that's these here, so that's a buttercup. Okay, now you probably would have known most of them, but that's the idea. So you go through and you answer the questions based on looking at the plant or animal, which is where I think we could just take a photograph. We have another one down here for animals. So if there are legs present, you go to question 2. If there are legs absent, you go to question 3. Okay, so I don't know. Let's say I'm trying to identify this here, B. So legs are absent. So I go to question 3. The body is divided into segments. The body is not divided into segments. Sorry, no. So that does not seem to be divided into segments. Body not divided into segments. It tells me to go to 5. So I go to 5. Shell present or no shell present. So that definitely doesn't have a shell there, B, which means it's a slug. Yeah, so that's the idea of how you use these keys to identify the different plants and animals. Okay, so you can find those keys online. So we'll have keys ready to identify, like I have keys for, the normal leaves that you find, the normal plants that you find in a woodland, grassland environment, and the normal trees that you find, the normal animals that you find. And you should be able to identify any of them from those keys. Yeah? So obviously, I think everybody would know that F is a snail. Yeah? So you probably don't need a key to identify that. You just write down that you found 4 snails. But if you're not sure, then maybe you need the key to help identify. Yeah? So that's it. So what I'm going to ask you to do is obviously take down notes, okay? Because I'm not going to do the notes part of this again when we get into school. We're just going to go straight, and I'm going to be like, right, let's go. Make sure you know what to do. So you're going to make sure you have your 5 steps. Today we have done 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so a little bit more detail on 1, 2, and 3. And then for homework, I'd like you to do this question and see, can you identify the 4 animals? Yeah, so that's what I want you to do for homework, please. And that's due for Thursday. Okay, thanks guys.